Oh my God, I can't believe this. Brian Flores is about to set the entire NFL world on absolute fire. We have the accusations from Brian Flores, John Elway being hungover in one of his interviews, him being incentivized to tank for the Miami Dolphins, and a brutal accusation of the hiring process in the NFL being potentially racist. And we're gonna bring you all of that. Before we get to the content, I'm just gonna let you know, this is our third video of the day. This video is gonna get demonetized. Anytime we dive into something as sensitive as race, YouTube flags that as a sensitive topic. It's not going to recommend it to a larger audience because it can't make money off of my video, which I don't care about. I just care that a lot of you guys see this video. Some of you guys may even be convinced to subscribe and turn on our notifications. We're also giving away $500 to a follower on my Instagram. And now that we get all that out of the way, Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? Guys, this all starts out in one of the most interesting ways that I've ever seen. Bill Belichick actually made a media goof. I can't believe that I'm saying this, but it starts out with this text message between Bill Belichick and Brian Daboll. Wait, my bad, not Brian Daboll, Brian Flores. Who would make such a mistake? Well, Bill Belichick would. Check this out. Bill Belichick texts Brian Flores saying, "Sounds like you have landed. Congrats." Brian Flores says, "Did you hear something I didn't hear?" And then Bill Belichick says, "Giants?" Brian Flores says, "I interview on Thursday. I think I have a shot at it." And then Belichick says, "Got it. I hear from Buffalo and the New York Giants that you are their guy. Hope it works out if you want it to." Brian Flores says, "That's definitely what I want. I hope you're right, coach. Thank you." And then he sends another message saying, "Coach, are you talking to Brian Flores or Brian Daboll? Just making sure." And Bill Belichick messages back saying, "Sorry, I fucked this up. I double checked and I misread the text. I think they are naming Daboll. I am sorry about that, BB." Thanks, Bill. So you need to understand the context of the situation as to why this is such a big deal. One, Brian Flores has a tremendous attachment to the New York Giants job because he is a Brooklyn native. So you might be wondering, okay, big deal. Another head coach got the job over him. What's the big deal over this? Well, apparently, according to this lawsuit that Brian Flores is filing against the New York Giants and the NFL, Brian Flores alleges that the New York Giants had already made a decision on their brand new head coach, Brian Daboll, and then decided to interview Brian Flores anyways, just so they could fill their obligation to the Rooney Rule. So there's a lot to this, man. This lawsuit is filled with some crazy stuff, like some of the weird stuff that the Miami Dolphins would do, John Elway being hungover during his interview. So let's take it one step at a time. I've never seen Bill Belichick screw something up the way he just did, and the fact that he did that was actually, to me, kind of comical. In the sense of whether or not Brian Flores was racially discriminated against, at least here's my perception of the New York Giants job. I initially made a video saying Brian Flores to the Giants was a possibility. Apparently, according to Jordan Schultz, him and Deshaun Watson wanted to team up on the New York Giants, and it made a lot of sense. Brian Flores is from Brooklyn. Deshaun Watson had investment contacts in New York. He wanted to be part of a large market. It made a lot of sense. But the thing is, when John Mara came out and said, "We are committed to Daniel Jones as our quarterback of the future," the script kind of flipped in terms of what they were looking for in their next head coach. I mean, think of it this way. Do you want the head coach that is credited for transforming a running back into one of the top 3 or top 2 quarterbacks in the entire NFL? Or do you want the head coach that consistently stamped his feet and said, "Hey, I don't want Tua Tagovailoa. I want you to trade this man for Deshaun Watson"? Now, I want to follow up that statement by saying I personally believe that Brian Flores shouldn't have been fired to begin with. And the fact that he did get fired was very sketchy to me. I mean, when you have, without a doubt, the greatest head coach in your entire franchise's past 3 decades, and then you just decide to fire him abruptly, this kind of reminds me of the Jim Harbaugh situation, although a much less successful version of it, obviously, from the early 2010s. We're going to get to the part of the lawsuit where he addresses Stephen Ross and the Miami Dolphins. I wanted to close out this New York Giants segment of the video by saying this is their response to Brian Flores' accusations of them already wanting Brian Daboll, but interviewing Brian Flores Flores just so they could fulfill the Rooney Rule, saying that we are pleased and confident with the process that resulted in the hiring of Brian Daboll. We interviewed an impressive and diverse group of candidates. The fact of the matter is, Brian Flores was in the conversation to be our head coach until the 11th hour. Ultimately, we hired the individual we felt was the most qualified to be our next head coach. Ultimately, I feel like the New York Giants had two choices. They could have either went the Brian Flores and Deshaun Watson route, or they could have went the Daniel Jones and the Brian Daboll route. And they decided to stick with Daniel Jones and pair him with Brian Daboll, and I'm excited to see what that yields. The next part of this courageous lawsuit involves the Miami Dolphins. And the Miami Dolphins are an absolute dumpster fire, and it's easy to see why in this lawsuit. It seems like the theme of this is that the owner of the Miami Dolphins would want him to do something sketchy. Brian Flores seems like a very honorable individual, at least from my limited perception of him, based off of the way he carries himself and based off of how he was able to win over a locker room and turn around a team that had absolutely no culture whatsoever. It starts by saying that in the very beginning, Stephen Ross told Brian Flores that he would pay him $100,000 for each game lost that year. Then when the Dolphins started winning games due in no small part to Mr. Flores' coaching, Mr. Flores was told by the team's general manager, Chris Greer, that Steve was mad that Mr. Flores' success in winning games that year was compromising the team's draft position. If you remember back then, the Miami Dolphins were tanking for Tua. As the year progressed on, they wanted to tank for Joe Burrow. They offered multiple first-round picks in order to try to get Joe Burrow, and eventually what ended up happening is they would select number 5 overall, and unfortunately they didn't end up with Joe Burrow or Justin Herbert. Now in this instance, man, I had tremendous respect for what Brian Flores did in his first year. I think whenever you have an opportunity to completely shape a culture, which Brian Flores was able to do so, people don't remember this, but in the beginning of the season, in Brian Flores' rookie year as the head coach of the Miami Dolphins, all of their best players wanted out. They had to trade Minkah Fitzpatrick. They traded Laramie Tunsil for multiple first-round picks. It seemed like this team was destined for tanking. And the fact that Brian Flores was able to rally the troops together towards the end of the season, I would happily prefer to be 5 picks lower but have a head coach that my team believes in than potentially the opportunity to draft Joe Burrow. But of course, you could easily make the counter argument, dude, he lost out on Joe Burrow. They probably would have been instant contenders if they drafted Joe Burrow. And you could definitely make that argument here as well. But personally, for me, I think it's so easy to tank for draft picks. And I feel like it's so hard to build a winning culture in a locker room. I feel like that's what Brian Flores brought to the table for the Dolphins. Unfortunately, that's not what the Dolphins valued. You see what happened to Trevor Lawrence with the Jacksonville Jaguars, the most transcendent quarterback since Andrew Luck. And what happened to him? He was an absolute dumpster fire his rookie year because there was no stable culture. He had a sham head coach, and clearly the ownership in Jacksonville has no freaking idea what they're doing. He also mentions the fact that Stephen Ross tried to pressure Brian Flores to recruit a prominent quarterback in violation of league tampering rules. Brian Flores repeatedly refused to comply with these improper directives. In the winter of 2020, Mr. Ross said, "Screw it, I'm going to invite Brian Flores onto a yacht for lunch." Shortly after he arrived, Mr. Ross told Mr. Flores that his prominent quarterback was conveniently arriving at the marina. Obviously, Mr. Ross had attempted to quote-unquote set up a purportedly impromptu meeting between Mr. Flores and the prominent quarterback. Mr. Flores refused the meeting and left the yacht immediately. Now, here's what's interesting. You might be wondering, who is this prominent quarterback? Is it Deshaun Watson? Because it seems like the Miami Dolphins have been obsessed with Deshaun Watson recently. We have to remember that during the 2020 offseason, Deshaun Watson was happy in Houston. It wasn't Deshaun Watson, but we might have an idea of who it is based upon the quarterback free agency class that was available in 2020 that composed of Tom Brady, Phillip Rivers, Dak Prescott, Jameis Winston, Teddy Bridgewater, Marcus Mariota, Ryan Tannehill, and Drew Brees. Now, you might be thinking, hey, it's interesting that the terminology this lawsuit is using is prominent. It's also interesting that Brian Flores worked with Tom Brady when he was on the New England Patriots. It's even more interesting that Tom Brady inevitably went to Florida to finish out his career, and get a load of this. Brian Flores even said back then that he agrees with Stephen Ross on the thought of why would Tom Brady come to Miami. He reiterated several times that he's happy with Ryan Fitzpatrick. It's important for the Dolphins to find a QB of the future, but it will likely come via the draft. So that's a really interesting part of this story. It closes off by saying over the remaining year and a half of Mr. Flores' tenure at the helm of the Miami Dolphins, he was routinely made to feel uncomfortable based upon his decision not to tank in order to secure the top pick in the 2019 NFL Draft. Upon information and belief, no white head coach has ever been subjected to such ridicule over winning and holding the spirit of the game in such high regard. In fact, Mr. Flores was ultimately terminated and subsequently defamed throughout the media and the league, as he was labeled by the Dolphins brass as someone who was difficult to work with. This is reflective of an all too familiar quote-unquote angry black man stigma that is often casted upon black men who are strong in their morals and convictions, while white men are coined as passionate. For me, I would look at Brian Flores and I would say this is clearly a head coach that completely changed a horrible culture in Miami in a span of 2 years, and the organization has historically been a dumpster fire, so therefore I would be looking at Brian Flores as a tremendous catch for any head coaching vacancy. But unfortunately, I don't know if that's what NFL owners are thinking. Now, it seems to me, at least in my opinion, it just seems like the owner of the Miami Dolphins and Brian Flores were just not on the same page. The owner of the Miami Dolphins likes doing sketchy stuff. Brian Flores seems to be a blue-collar, by-the-book type of guy that wants to build a culture the correct way. And honestly, I think that's extremely valuable. But it seems like Stephen Ross wanted some sketchy guy that would do the weird things that he would want, that he would believe would contribute to his team winning, even though I don't necessarily agree with it. I think the most ridiculous part of this interview, and I just found out, it was the 2019 interview, not necessarily the more recent interview in 2022, where Brian Flores had an interview with the Denver Broncos. However, the Broncos general manager, John Elway, Joe Ellis, who was the president and chief executive officer, showed up an hour late to the interview. They looked completely disheveled, and it was obvious that they had been drinking heavily the night before. It was clear from the substance of the interview that Mr. Flores was interviewed only because of the Rooney Rule, and that the Broncos never had any intention to consider him as a legitimate candidate for the job. Shortly after, Vic Fangio, a white man, was hired to be the head coach of the Broncos. Ultimately, man, I have to say, whether you believe that there were racial motivations behind this or not, I have tremendous respect for Brian Flores, and I hope each and every one of my viewers, regardless of where you stand on the spectrum, can respect the fact that this man is giving up his job prospects essentially for a chance to completely shape and change the way the league operates. Because I admit, I think it's very sketchy that David Culley had a pretty good year based off of what he was given for the Houston Texans, and then he was fired. And then you have Brian Flores, who, in my opinion, is a home run of a head coach. I mean, it's very rare to find a Bill Belichick disciple that is as good of a head coach as Brian Flores was. So the fact that he was fired despite that, and the fact that he might not get another job here, yes, I understand it's hard to get coaching jobs in the NFL, but this is a man that had winning seasons with the team that he was a part of. And if you look at the Miami Dolphins team his first year, you'd understand this team had very little talent, and he was able to make them look damn good. He didn't make it to the playoffs, but he had a 10-win season in his second year, and he had a 9-win season in his last year. So honestly, I really hope this doesn't affect his job prospects. I really hope things change, because talented individuals like Brian Flores should be coaching at the NFL level. Let me know in the comment section down below. Do you agree with what I said? I know that this could be a little polarizing, so I hope I did a good job covering this topic. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.